So we're going to be listening to What Is to Be Done by Lenin. For the daily routine today, I'm just going to be meditating.
From very flashpoints.
But tomorrow we'll be doing the full routine.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2021 edition of Socialism for All. It is an audiobook of Lenin's What Is to Be Done from 1902 with comments and discussion. In fact, although it is being finished and published in January 2021, this is a very long file. I began it months ago, so you'll hear my voice go through several different changes in inflection over the course of the file. I hope it's not too distracting. So let's get into first the notes on the text. This came from Marxists.org, the Marxist Internet Archive, which hosts thousands of Marxist files for free. Please go check them out, support them if you can. So What Is to Be Done, Vladimir Lenin, first published 1902, transcription by Tim Delaney. This printable edition, it's a PDF, produced by Chris Russell for the Marxists Internet Archive. It says, please note the text may make reference to page numbers within this document. The page numbers were maintained during the transcription process to remain faithful to the original edition and not this edition, therefore are likely to be inaccurate. And then editorial note, this is Lenin's key work on party objectives and organization. Lenin argues that while capitalism predisposes the workers to the acceptance of socialism, it does not spontaneously make them conscious socialists. The proletariat of its own can achieve only, quote, trade union consciousness. Accordingly, it was necessary to institute a, quote, party of a new type, capable of imbuing the working class with revolutionary consciousness. This is the origin of Lenin's famous theory of the party as, quote, vanguard of the proletariat. He conceived of the vanguard as a highly centralized body organized around a core of experienced professional revolutionaries. Only such a party could succeed in the conditions of illegality prevailing in Tsarist Russia at the time. The book also contains an attack on revisionism. So a couple of notes from me before we get into the text itself also. This is an important work. It's widely referenced. It is a cornerstone of the calls for the Russian socialist movement to coalesce into something that we know, history shows, 15 years later, following these exact arguments and suggestions, was successful in achieving revolution in very adverse conditions. Accordingly, it is entry number 6 in the basic Marxist-Leninist study plan. We have a playlist for that plan on this channel. As of the time of publication, we have 25 out of the 26 texts up online. There's just one that's missing. However, all that said, I mean, the fact that Lenin was right in the suggestions that he was making here, and in fact, for me, many of the arguments that he makes against other, competitors and allies and, different other factions in the movement, I see them in the U.S. left today. People who, just play at democracy and, use consensus process to just pass resolutions, but don't actually do anything as an organization. I've seen that. It's a fucking waste of time. It's terrible. I mean, it really just, it's important for us right now in the United States in 2021 to take some of the insights in here and apply them to our current situation. It's imperative right now. And there are a number of different groups, DSA, all working around the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders, of course, following on the heels of Occupy, took a lot of the same demands of, people that are facing hardship in this country, took a lot of the demands that were articulated during Occupy, gave those a bigger platform for about 5 years in his 2 campaigns, and then promptly fed the entire movement into the wood chipper of the Democratic Party, which has long been known for decades as the graveyard of social movements. And Sanders knows this. He virtually disappeared after endorsing Joe Biden last April, and we've been left to fend on our own. We, of course, saw many spontaneous uprisings in the months following that. Of course, COVID and the murder of George Floyd were flashpoints, but, it doesn't change the fact that the working class, it's a giant pile of kindling. There are tent cities in major cities. It's a horrendous situation in the richest country in the history of the world. So, what do? Well, this is Lenin's attempt at answering all of those questions, and like I said, an important text that I think there are many parallels to today. Unfortunately, I find this work just kind of boring in large stretches by the way it's written. We need to figure out some of these lessons. Like I said, I just wish that some stretches of this document were edited, maybe divided into a couple of different documents, because there will be long passages in what is to be done that I'm like just brilliant, leaping out of the chair and saying, yes, yes, this, I entirely agree. And then also long stretches of like 10 or 20 pages where I'm falling asleep. So I don't know. If you find that to be the case, stick with it. I guess that's ultimately my point here, is just stick with it, because especially near the end of the document, it again still kind of vacillates between very engaging and you had to be there type of things, I think, in his description. Right up to the very end, there are important points. So anyway, that's my little preface on reading what is to be done, which again, I feel like is, even just among other things Lenin has written, not necessarily the best organized work, my opinion. All right, with all that said, let's get into the audiobook. Preface. According to the author's original plan, the present pamphlet was to have been devoted to a detailed development of the ideas expressed in the article Where to Begin, from Iskra number 4, May 1901. We must first apologize to the reader for the delay in fulfilling the promise made in that article, and repeated in response to many private inquiries and letters. One of the reasons for this delay was the attempt, undertaken in June of the past year, 1901, to unite all the social democratic organizations abroad. It was natural to wait for the results of this attempt, for, had the effort proved successful, it would perhaps have been necessary to expound Iskra's conceptions of organization from a somewhat different approach. In any case, such a success promised to put an end very quickly to the existence of the two trends in the Russian social democratic movement. As the reader knows, the attempt failed, and as we propose to show, was bound to fail after the new swing of Рабочее дело in its issue number 10 towards economism. It was found to be absolutely essential to begin a determined struggle against this trend, diffuse and ill-defined, but for that reason the more persistent, the more capable of reasserting itself in diverse forms. Accordingly, the original plan of the pamphlet was altered and considerably enlarged. Its main theme was to have been the three questions raised in the article Where to Begin: the character and main content of our political agitation, our organizational tasks, and the plan for building, simultaneously and from various sides, a militant all-Russia organization. These questions have long engaged the mind of the author, who tried to raise them in Рабочая Gazeta during one of the unsuccessful attempts to revive that paper, see Chapter 5. But the original plan to confine the pamphlet to an analysis of only these three questions, and to set forth our views as far as possible in a positive form, without or almost without entering into polemics, proved wholly impracticable for two reasons. On the one hand, economism proved to be much more tenacious than we had supposed. We employ the term economism in the broad sense, as explained in Iskra number 12, December 1901, in the article entitled A Talk with Defenders of Economism, which was a synopsis, so to speak, of the present pamphlet. It became clear beyond doubt that the differences regarding the solution of the three questions mentioned were explainable to a far greater degree by the basic antithesis between the two trends in the Russian social democratic movement than by differences over details. On the other hand, the perplexity of the economists over the practical application of our views in Iskra clearly revealed that we often speak literally in different tongues, and therefore cannot arrive at an understanding without beginning ab ovo, and that an attempt must be made in the simplest possible style, illustrated by numerous and concrete examples, systematically to clarify all our basic points of difference with all the economists. I resolved to make such an attempt at clarification, fully realizing that it would greatly increase the size of the pamphlet and delay its publication. I saw no other way of meeting my pledge I had made in the article where to begin. Thus, to the apologies for the delay, I must add others for the serious literary shortcomings of the pamphlet. I had to work in great haste with frequent interruptions by a variety of other tasks. The examination of the above three questions still constitutes the main theme of this pamphlet, but I found it necessary to begin with two questions of a more general nature. Why such an innocent and natural slogan as freedom of criticism should be for us a veritable war cry, and why we cannot come to an understanding even on the fundamental question of the role of social democrats in relation to the spontaneous mass movement. Further, the exposition of our views on the character and substance of political agitation developed into an explanation of the difference between trade unionist politics and social democratic politics, while the exposition of our views on organizational tasks developed into an explanation of the difference between the amateurish methods which satisfy the economists and the organization of revolutionaries which we hold to be indispensable. Further, I advanced a plan for an all-Russia political newspaper, with all the more insistence because the objections raised against it are untenable, and because no real answer has been given to the question I raised in the article where to begin, as to how we can set to work from all sides simultaneously to create the organization we need. Finally, in the concluding part, I hope to show that we did all we could to prevent a decisive break with the economists, a break which nevertheless proved inevitable, that Рабочее дело acquired a special significance, a historical significance, if you will, because it expressed fully and strikingly, not consistent economism, but the confusion and vacillation which constitute the distinguishing feature of an entire period in the history of Russian social democracy, and that therefore the polemic with Рабочее дело, which may upon first view seem excessively detailed, also acquires significance, for we can make no progress until we have completely put an end to this period. N. Lenin, February 1902. Chapter 1. Dogmatism and Freedom of Criticism. 1.1. What does freedom of criticism mean? Freedom of criticism is undoubtedly the most fashionable slogan at the present time, and the one most frequently employed in the controversies between socialists and Democrats in all countries. At first sight, nothing would appear to be more strange than the solemn appeals to freedom of criticism made by one of the parties to the dispute. Have voices been raised in the advanced parties against the constitutional law of the majority of European countries which guarantees freedom to science and scientific investigation? Something must be wrong here, will be the comment of the onlooker who has heard this fashionable slogan repeated at every turn, but has not yet penetrated the essence of the disagreement among the disputants. Evidently, this slogan is one of the most controversial phrases which, like nicknames, become legitimized by use and become almost generic terms. In fact, it is no secret for anyone that two trends have taken form in present-day international social democracy. The conflict between these trends now flares up in a bright flame and now dies down, and smolders under the ashes of imposing, quote, truce resolutions. The essence of the, quote, new trend, which adopts a, quote, critical attitude towards, quote, obsolete dogmatic Marxism, has been clearly enough presented by Bernstein and demonstrated by Millerand. Social democracy must change from a party of social revolution into a democratic party of social reforms. Bernstein has surrounded this political demand with a whole battery of well-attuned, quote, new arguments and reasonings. Denied was the possibility of putting socialism on a scientific basis and of demonstrating its necessity and inevitability from the point of view of the materialist conception of history. Denied was the fact of growing impoverishment, the process of proletarization, and the intensification of capitalist contradictions. The very concept, the quote, ultimate aim, was declared to be unsound, and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was completely rejected. Denied was the antithesis in principle between liberalism and socialism. Denied was the theory of the class struggle, on the alleged grounds that it could not be applied to a strictly democratic society governed according to the will of the majority, etc. Quick comment from Socialism for All. Just so you see here, they were already calling Marxism obsolete and dogmatic as early as 1902, which to me just says they never really wanted to hear it. They say it today, they said it in the 50s, they said it in 1902. As you can see, they just don't want to hear it. People who don't accept class struggle, don't accept that capitalism runs on simple logic. Marxism was correct then, and it's still correct now, because the logic of capitalism has not changed. Okay, back to the text. Thus, the demand for a decisive turn from revolutionary social democracy to bourgeois social reformism was accompanied by a no less decisive turn toward bourgeois criticism of all the fundamental ideas of Marxism. In view of the fact that this criticism of Marxism has long been directed from the political platform, from university chairs, in numerous pamphlets, and in a series of learned treatises, in view of the fact that the entire younger generation of the educated classes has been systematically reared for decades on this criticism, it is not surprising that the, quote, new critical trend in social democracy should spring up, all complete, like Minerva from the head of Jove. The content of this new trend did not have to grow and take shape. It was transferred bodily from bourgeois to socialist literature. To proceed, if Bernstein's theoretical criticism and political yearnings were still unclear to anyone, the French took the trouble strikingly to demonstrate the, quote, new method. In this instance, too, France has justified its old reputation of being, quote, the land where, more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a decision, quote, from Engels' Introduction to Marx's 18th Brumaire. The French socialists have begun not to theorize but to act. The democratically more highly developed political conditions in France have permitted them to put, quote, Bernsteinism into practice immediately, with all its consequences. Millerand has furnished an excellent example of practical Bernsteinism. Not without reason did Bernstein and Volmar rush so zealously to defend and laud him. Indeed, if social democracy, in essence, is merely a party of reform, and must be bold enough to admit this openly, then not only has a socialist the right to join a bourgeois cabinet, but he must always strive to do so. If democracy, in essence, means the abolition of class domination, then why should not a socialist minister charm the whole bourgeois world by orations on class collaboration? Why should he not remain in the cabinet even after the shooting down of workers by gendarmes has exposed, for the 100th and 1000th time, the real nature of the democratic collaboration of classes? Why should he not personally take part in greeting the Tsar, for whom the French socialists now have no other name than hero of the gallows, knout and exile? And the reward for this utter humiliation and self-degradation of socialism in the face of the whole world, for the corruption of the socialist consciousness of the working masses, the only basis that can guarantee our victory, the reward for this is pompous projects for miserable reforms, so miserable, in fact, that much more has been obtained from bourgeois governments. He who does not deliberately close his eyes cannot fail to see that the new, quote, critical trend in socialism is nothing more nor less than a new variety of opportunism. And if we judge people not by the glittering uniforms they don or by the high-sounding appellations they give themselves, but by their actions and by what they actually advocate, it will be clear that, quote, freedom of criticism means freedom for an opportunistic trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. Quick comment there from S4A. Opportunism, what is it? Opportunism is when people claim to be socialists and then they look at an alliance with a party which contains a fundamental difference that is not resolvable, and they just sort of paper over this fundamental difference. So in other words, it's somebody who proposes an alliance with somebody with whom an alliance really is not possible. Okay, back to the text. Freedom is a grand word, but under the banner of freedom for industry, the most predatory wars were waged. Under the banner of freedom of labor, the working people were robbed. The modern use of the term freedom of criticism contains the same inherent falsehood. Those who are really convinced that they have made progress in science would not demand freedom for the new views to continue side by side with the old, but the substitution of the new views for the old. The cry heard today, "Long live freedom of criticism," is too strongly reminiscent of the fable of the empty barrel. We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under their fire. We have combined, by a freely adopted decision, for the purpose of fighting the enemy, and not of retreating into the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, from the very outset, have reproached us with having separated ourselves into an exclusive group, and with having chosen the path of struggle ahead of the path of conciliation. And now some among us begin to cry out, "Let us go into the marsh." And when we begin to shame them, they retort, "What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take a better road?" Oh yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves wherever you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render you every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands, don't clutch at us, and don't besmirch the grand word freedom, for we too are free to go where we please, free to fight not only against the marsh, but also against those who are turning toward the marsh. Section 1.2. The New Advocates of Freedom of Criticism. Now, this slogan, freedom of criticism, has in recent times been solemnly advanced by Рабочее Дело No. 10, organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats abroad, not as a theoretical postulate, but as a political demand, as a reply to the question, is it possible to unite the social democratic organizations operating abroad? For a durable unity, there must be freedom of criticism, quote, they say. From this statement, two definite conclusions follow. One, that Рабочее Дело has taken under its wing the opportunist trend in international social democracy in general, and two, that Рабочее Дело demands freedom for opportunism in Russian social democracy. Let us examine these conditions. Рабочее Дело is, quote, particularly displeased with the, quote, inclination of Iskra and Zarya to predict a rupture between the Mountain and the Gironde in international social democracy. Generally speaking, writes B. Khrushchevsky, editor of Рабочее Дело, quote, this talk of the Mountain and the Gironde, heard in the ranks of social democracy, represents a shallow historical analogy, a strange thing to come from the pen of a Marxist. The Mountain and Gironde did not represent different temperaments or intellectual trends, as the historians of social thought may think, but different classes or strata, the middle bourgeoisie on the one hand and the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat on the other. In the modern socialist movement, however, there is no conflict of class interests. The socialist movement in its entirety, in all of its diverse forms, including the pronounced Bernsteinians, stands on the basis of the class interests of the proletariat and its class struggle for political and economic emancipation, unquote. A bold assertion. Has not Khrushchevsky heard of the fact, long ago noted, that it is precisely the extensive participation of a, quote, academic stratum in the socialist movement in recent years that has promoted such a rapid spread of Bernsteinism? And what is most important, on what does our author found his opinion that even, quote, the most pronounced Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle for the political and economic emancipation of the proletariat? No one knows. This determined defense of the most pronounced Bernsteinians is not supported by any argument or reasoning whatsoever. Apparently, the author believes that if he repeats what the most pronounced Bernsteinians say about themselves, his assertion requires no proof. But can anything more, quote, shallow be imagined than this judgment of an entire trend based on nothing more than what the representatives of that trend say about themselves? Can anything more shallow be imagined than the subsequent homily on the two different and even diametrically opposite types or paths of party development. The German Social Democrats, in other words, recognize complete freedom of criticism, but the French do not, and it is precisely their example that demonstrates the, quote, bane of intolerance. To this we can only say that the very example B. Krzyzewski affords us attests to the fact that the name Marxists is at times assumed by people who conceive history literally in the Ilovaisky manner, to explain the unity of the German Socialist Party and the disunity of the French Socialist Party. There is no need whatever to go into the special features in the history of these countries, to contrast the conditions of military semi-absolutism in the one with republican parliamentarism in the other, to analyze the effects of the Paris Commune and the effects of the exceptional law against the socialists, to compare the economic life and economic development of the two countries, or to recall that, quote, the unexampled growth of German social democracy was accompanied by a strenuous struggle, unique in the history of socialism, not only against erroneous theories, Muhlenberger, Düring, the Catheter socialists, but also against erroneous tactics, Lassalle, etc., etc. All that is superfluous. The French quarrel among themselves because they are intolerant. The Germans are united because they are good boys. And observe, this piece of matchless profundity is designed to refute the fact that puts to rout the defense of the Bernsteinians. The question whether or not the Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle of the proletariat is one that can be completely and irrevocably answered only by historical experience. Consequently, the example of France holds greatest significance in this respect because France is the only country in which the Bernsteinians attempted to stand independently on their own feet with the warm approval of their German colleagues and partly also of the Russian opportunists. The reference to the intolerance of the French, apart from its historical significance, turns out to be merely an attempt to hush up very unpleasant facts with angry invectives. Nor are we inclined to make a present of the Germans to Krzyzewski and the numerous other champions of freedom of criticism. If the, quote, most pronounced Bernsteinians are still tolerated in the ranks of the German party, it is only to the extent that they submit to the Hanover Resolution, which emphatically rejected Bernstein's amendments, and to the Lubeck Resolution, which, notwithstanding the diplomatic terms in which it is couched, contains a direct warning to Bernstein. It is debatable, from the standpoint of the interests of the German party, whether diplomacy was appropriate and whether, in this case, a bad peace is better than a good quarrel. In short, opinions may differ as to the expediency of any one of the methods employed to reject Bernsteinism, but that the German party did reject Bernsteinism on two occasions is a fact that no one can fail to see. Therefore, to think that the German example confirms the thesis that, quote, the most pronounced Bernsteinians stand on the basis of the class struggle of the proletariat for political and economic emancipation, unquote, means to fail completely to understand what is going on under our very eyes. Nor is that all. As we have seen, Rabotche Diallo demands, quote, freedom of criticism, and defends Bernsteinism before Russian social democracy. Apparently, it convinced itself that we were unfair to our critics and Bernsteinians. But to which ones? Who? Where? When? What did the unfairness represent? About this, not a word. Rabotche Diallo does not name a single Russian critic or Bernsteinian. We are left with but one of two possible suppositions. Either the unfairly treated party is none other than Rabotche Diallo itself. This is confirmed by the fact that in the two articles in number 10, reference is made only to the wrongs suffered by Rabotche Diallo at the hands of Zara and Iskra. If that is the case, how is the strange fact to be explained that Rabotche Diallo, which always vehemently dissociated itself from all solidarity with Bernsteinism, could not defend itself without putting in a word in defense of the most pronounced Bernsteinians and of freedom of criticism, or some third persons have been treated unfairly? If this is the case, then what reasons may there be for not naming them? We see, therefore, that Rabotche Diallo is continuing to play the game of hide-and-seek it has played as we shall show below, ever since its founding. And let us note further this first practical application of the vaunted freedom of criticism. In actual fact, not only was it forthwith reduced to abstention from all criticism, but also to abstention from expressing independent views altogether. The very Rabotchie Dielo, which avoids mentioning Russian Bernsteinism as if it were a shameful disease, to use Starover's apt expression, proposes for the treatment of this disease to copy word for word the latest German prescription for the German variety of the malady. Instead of freedom of criticism, slavish, worse, apish imitation. The very same social and political content of modern international opportunism reveals itself in a variety of ways according to national peculiarities. In one country, the opportunists have long ago come out under a separate flag. In another, they have ignored theory and in fact pursued the policy of the radical socialists. In a third, some members of the Revolutionary Party have deserted to the camp of opportunism and strive to achieve their aims, not in open struggle for principles and for new tactics, but by gradual, imperceptible, and, if one may so put it, unpunishable corruption of their party. In a fourth country, similar deserters employ the same methods in the gloom of political slavery, and with a completely original combination of legal and illegal activity, etc. To talk of freedom of criticism and of Bernsteinism as a condition for uniting the Russian Social Democrats, and not to explain how Russian Bernsteinism has manifested itself and what particular fruits it has borne, amounts to talking with the aim of saying nothing. Let ourselves try, if only in a few words, to say what Rabotchie Dielo did not want to say, or which was, perhaps, beyond its comprehension. 1.3. Criticism in Russia. The chief distinguishing feature of Russia in regard to the point we are examining is that the very beginning of the spontaneous working class movement, on the one hand, and of the turn of progressive public opinion towards Marxism on the other, was marked by the combination of manifestly heterogeneous elements under a common flag to fight the common enemy, the obsolete social and political world outlook. We refer to the heyday of, quote, legal Marxism. Speaking generally, this was an altogether curious phenomenon that no one in the 80s or the beginning of the 90s would have believed possible. In a country ruled by an autocracy, with a completely enslaved press, in a period of desperate political reaction in which even the tiniest outgrowth of political discontent and protest is persecuted, the theory of revolutionary Marxism suddenly forces its way into the censored literature and, though expounded in Aesopian language, is understood by all the interested. The government had accustomed itself to regarding only the theory of the revolutionary Narodnaya Volya as dangerous, without, as is usual, observing its internal evolution and rejoicing at any criticism leveled against it. Quite a considerable time elapsed, by our Russian standards, before the government realized what had happened, and the unwieldy army of censors and gendarmes discovered the new enemy and flung itself upon him. Meanwhile, Marxist books were published one after another, Marxist journals and newspapers were founded, nearly everyone became a Marxist, Marxists were flattered, Marxists were courted, and the book publishers rejoiced at the extraordinary ready sale of Marxist literature.
So we're going to stop there for now, because I got to go to work. And we just sat for 30 minutes listening to the beginning of What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, and we're going to be listening to that every day for the next few weeks. Probably it'll only take a week, and we're going to listen to some other podcasts about it. For example, How to Make a Revolution by the Revolutionary Communists of America and other groups like this. So he talked about Bernsteinism, which is basically, can you reform your way out of fascism? Can you reform your way out of a dictatorship? Can you reform your way out of capitalism, which leads to fascism? Because Bernstein was basically a liberal. He said he was a socialist, but he's basically a passive liberal saying, oh, we don't need a violent revolution, we can just reform. And in the end, that never works, because the fascists are violent, the capitalists are violent, and they will pay unscrupulous people to hurt you, to stop you from getting what you need to survive, like healthcare, housing, education, transportation. They want to control all those things and charge you money, more money than you make, for access to these things. And since we can't afford it, we die of preventable diseases, we lose jobs or job opportunities because we can't get there and home in time to get enough sleep, so we're constantly tired and sick, and again, we can't afford health care, and so on. So that's enough for today. Listen to the audiobook What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin. It's difficult, it's boring, but he makes a lot of good points, and this is the foundational building block for starting a revolution.